So good afternoon to those who are in Israel. I should say good evening to those who are in Israel. Good afternoon to those who are in America. We are in Israel at least reaching the end of what is Rav Kook's yahretzeit, which also means it's the end of our Yom Aliyah, the anniversary of when our family made Aliyah 4 years ago. And the fact that Rav Kook's yahretzeit corresponds with our Yom Aliyah is something very, very special to us, for me specifically, because it always means that our lives, our family's lives, is fundamentally entwined with the life of Rav Kook. And that's particularly appropriate because, as some of you have heard me speak about before, I'm not sure we would have made it back to Israel if it wasn't for the Torah of Rav Kook, the inspiration that it gave us, and the fact that it was always sort of a beacon of light in the darkness. Always sort of reminding us where we are ultimately supposed to go. And in that sense, the fact that our aliyah is tied to Rav Kook is just hashgacha pratit, as they say. Couldn't be any other way. Many of you also probably know that I just finished publishing a book on Rav Kook. I'll just hold it up for a moment. I don't know if it's backwards or not, but Torah Goes Forth from Zion, Essays on the Thought of Rav Kook and Rav Shagar. And the book was very much a labor of love. And if I tried to give you all the reasons why I find Rav Kook inspiring and important, we wouldn't really have any chance to learn his Torah today. We just spend the next hour or more doing that. I've always been attracted to Rav Kook, particularly his idealism, his belief in the possibility, even the inevitability of a better world. And that sort of idealism that Rav Kook has very much animated my work as a rabbi. It still does, right? This notion that we're here to try to achieve something big and transformative. And for those of you that knew me in Cleveland, right, that's what we were striving to do with our shul. We were trying to do something that hadn't really ever been done before in Cleveland. And even in the work I do right now with the International Beit Din, trying to assist in freeing agunot, that in itself is also sort of an impossible transformative dream, right? Because the agunah problem has been around forever in one form or another, and there's a sense in which it's a bit intractable. But at the same time, I work for a Beit Din that's trying to find a way to help as many women as we can. And in general, the idealism, as I said, has been a big part of who I am and my rabbinates. And I've always been a little bothered when I see that other people aren't similarly inspired. When you look around, and what you see is that most people seem satisfied with the world as it is, right? The world as it is, all its imperfections, a lot of people just seem happy with that. For Rav Kook, that was simply not an option, and I follow in his path in that sense, that it was simply never an option for me as well. And when we think about Rav Kook's idealism, his aspiring to redemption, his anticipating redemption, his yearning for redemption, his belief that redemption might even be right here, right now, is a fundamental part of that. And what I want to begin with, just to give us a sense of Rav Kook's idealism, is that I want to briefly go through one of my favorite texts in the entirety of Rav Kook's teachings. It's a piece that was later incorporated into a collection of what's known as Orot HaKodesh. And it's just a very powerful text, very straightforward in a sense, but very, very powerful. And it captures Rav Kook's idealism, his yearning for redemption, and specifically, he frames it in this particular text in a very universalistic way. And what I mean by that is that as we read this text, you'll see these ideas of aspiring to a better world, of a world transformed, of a redeemed world. He puts it in a language that I think just about everybody can understand. Jew, non-Jew, it doesn't matter. He's touching here something very fundamental, something very, very primal. And he opens up this text with a very powerful opening sentence. He says, "Hachalamot gedolim yesod ha'olam hem." He says, the great dreams are the foundation of the world. That's his opening line. It's a great opening line. The great dreams are the foundation of the world. So of course, when you read words like that, which sound very powerful, you have to immediately ask yourself, what does it mean to say that the great dreams are the foundation of the world? Now, if you ask me, the first thing that comes to mind is the sense that dreams animate human existence, right? Dreams are what motivate us to not just live the everyday, but to strive for something more. If we think about when humanity tries to achieve its best, right, it is animated, it is fueled by this sense of the great dreams, right? It's like if you take away the great dreams, like what's left at the end of the day. And it's interesting too, because this language of upon which the world stands, right? We're familiar with that from Pirkei Avot, right? The rabbis traditionally say, right? There are three things upon which the world stands: Torah, v'avodah, v'gemilut chasadim, right? Torah, serving God, and acts of loving kindness. But here Rav Kook sort of puts that all aside and says, no. The foundation of the world are the great dreams. And I love that, because on some level I identify with the sense of being a dreamer. And there are not just small dreams, but great dreams that in a certain sense incorporate not just ourselves, but perhaps everyone. So Rav Kook goes on, he says that these dreams, these great dreams, they're manifested on different levels. The prophet's dream, as God is quoted as saying, I speak with him, the prophet, in a dream. The poet's dream while awake. The mighty thinker's dream of perfecting of the world. All of us dream of the time when God will return the captivity of Zion, of Zion. So Rav Kook goes on here to describe these great dreams that are the foundation of the world. How do they manifest? And he gives at least 3 or 4 different examples here. The first example is this idea of the prophetic dream. And it's something that we're familiar with from Chumash, from Tanakh, right? This idea that God communicates through dreams, particularly through either to prophets, but sometimes it's not even to prophets. Sometimes it's just somebody that God wants to talk to, right? That act of communication occurs in the context of a dream. And again, if you look at Bereshit, this is very common. God makes his will known through dreams. He even communicates to non-Jews, to Avimelech, for example, in his encounter with Abraham. He communicates to Avimelech directly through a dream. We're familiar with the dreams of Yosef, the dreams of Paro, which again are not God directly appearing, but the idea that God has a divine message that needs to be conveyed to them. And there's a sense, even almost on an intuitive level, right? The dreams are a form of prophecy. And in a more classic philosophical sense, at least the medieval philosophy, right? This idea that God appears to prophets in the context of a dream, not just while they're sleeping, but almost a prophetic dream in a sense can almost even happen when beyond that as well. And the Talmud actually states that dreams are 1/60th of prophecy. Any dream, right? Any and every dream is 1/60th of prophecy. So the first way in which the great dreams are experienced is the prophetic dream, the dream in which God communicates to human beings. And as I said, we're familiar with that from the Torah. And we might even be familiar with this in our own lives, right? We all often experience our own dreams as perhaps telling us something important, something profound, something about the way the world is, or the way that we should be in the world, that exceeds our ability to sort of understand it in a rational fashion. I think we all know dreams have a power to them. And you might think of something in a dream that will animate your waking life in a very significant fashion. Right? The other kind of dream, or the next kind of dream that Rav Kook cites here, is the poet, right? And he says here, the poet's dream while awake. And what he's presumably referring to is this idea that poets, in their immersion in creativity, right, that creative, we might even call it daydream, is a place in which they bring new words, new ideas to the fore. So the poet's dream, but unlike the prophetic dream, which is ostensibly when people are sleeping, the poet's dream when people are awake, or when they themselves are awake, right? But it's still a dream, and it still taps into these great dreams. We're told the mighty thinkers dream of perfecting the world, right? And again, the mighty thinkers, we would assume, are the great thinkers of human history. And what's interesting for Rav Kook is that the dream that animates the great thinkers is this idea of tikkun olam, is this idea of perfecting the world. That's the language that Rav Kook uses here. Cholmim balei machshava gedolim l'tikkun olam. They dream about rectifying, of fixing, of repairing the world. And again, that's a universal dream, right? He's not saying here the Jewish great thinkers. When he says the great thinkers, he's referring to humanity at large, right? That humanity's great dream, or the dream of the best of humanity, is to perfect the world, which we often think of as a Jewish dream, but Rav Kook is very sensitive to the fact that it is ultimately a universal dream, right? It is the dream of all human beings on some level. And then he concludes, as I mentioned, all of us dream of the time when God will return the Jewish people to Zion, to Israel, that there is a Jewish collective dream of redemption. And that dream of redemption, that great dream, is about the people returning to the land of Israel. So you see here again, Rav Kook is defining the great dreams that play out on different levels, and how they animate human existence, right? And how they motivate human existence. in very profound ways. Just use the example of Zionism here, right? The Jewish dream of the return to the land to Israel is what enabled the Jews to literally do the impossible, right? That's what Zionism is to a certain extent, right? The idea that Jews could return and build something there and survive against all odds, to a large extent, was an impossible dream, right? It was to the extreme. Everybody who looked at it, or most of the world who looked at it, thought it was a crazy thing to do. The Jews returning to Israel was no different than Don Quixote, charging at windmills, right? So, but that dream nevertheless enabled impossible things to happen. Now, that's the setup. There are great dreams. They matter. They motivate. They animate, and they can change the world. But we're immediately faced with a problem. And even with all of Rav Kook's idealism, he is deeply aware of the problem of having a great dream. And here's what he says. He says the problem is that the crudeness of conventional life, which is wholly immersed in its materialistic aspect, removes from the world the light of the dream. Right? The problem Rav Kook is saying here is that if you live in the real world, you start to understand very quickly that dreams die. And dreams die a rather horrible death in the real world, just to put it bluntly. And Rav Kook says the splendor of the dream's wide horizons and its ascent above the reality, all that just disappears. Thus, the world is in convulsion with pains engendered by the destructive toxins of reality, devoid of the brightness of the dream, right? Reality kills the dream. Reality essentially almost kills the great dreams. Dreams can't live in the reality of the world that we have today, the broken world that we have today. And Rav Kook is very much aware of this. And he doesn't use the language here, but we're sort of familiar with this, right? There's an expression that so-and-so had a rude awakening, right? You probably heard that before. And that is what, getting at this idea of having a dream, thinking that things can and should be a certain way, and then you suddenly realize that that's not true, right? I'm sure some of you have had the experience where you've had a really good dream, perhaps even a dream where you were like encountering a loved one who was no longer with you anymore, and you wake up and they're no longer there, and you realize that they've died again, and it feels terrible, right? Like to wake up from a dream, a great dream, is more than a rude awakening. It is something very painful. It sucks the life out of what you're feeling, and to a large extent, it's traumatic to have your dreams shatter. Unfortunately, there's something very traumatic about what it comes to experience the way in which the material world prevents the great dreams from coming to existence. And to a large extent, the sense of having a great dream, being motivated by a great dream, and then diving headfirst into reality and having that great dream just die. I'll just point out that this is very much the classic narrative of what happens for many people who make aliyah, right? When you move to Israel, you are often animated by this great dream of what you think it means to be here, what life is going to be like here, all the possibilities and the hopes and the potentials of being here. But it doesn't take long after you move here. And this is, again, a classic narrative that, as Rav Kook said, the destructive toxins of reality take over, right? And it's often the case that people come here with great dreams. And then when those dreams are kind of shattered, right, there's a profound sense of anger, frustration, pain, and trauma that ultimately comes through. And I guess I'll just add too, though Rav Kook is often presented as a dreamer himself, right? That's sort of the caricature of Rav Kook. He's the dreamer. He is the great dreamer. And to a certain extent, there's a sense in which he's out of touch with the world. In general, there's a sense like, well, Rav Kook, just believes it's all gonna happen, will happen, can happen. But when you read this text, you do recognize somebody who is in touch with reality, because you cannot write this text unless you've lived the experience of having your dreams, shatter. That's what Rav Kook is getting at here. He knows firsthand what it's like to believe something can happen, something beautiful and holy can happen, and then to see it not happen. So the world just destroy it. So the question again becomes, how do we recover from this? Can we recover from this, from the experience of having our dreams shatter, of having our idealism run headfirst into brick wall? So what's Rav Kook's answer? So what he goes on to tell us in this piece is that the pain of our dream not being made real, of the world destroying it, ultimately is only temporary, right? That's Rav Kook's, I guess, chiddush, you could say, that even though there is pain and there is suffering and the dream looks like it cannot happen, that is only a temporary experience, and that eventually, though it may take some time, right, the dream is ultimately going to be revealed. And that's what he says in the last part here. He says, but these pains are sufferings of love, the pain of the dream not being fulfilled. It's yusurei ahava, right? They are sufferings of love. They are necessary sufferings for what they will bring about. They'll purge the world and prove the error of those who boast of reality in its defective state. Meaning all those people who think the great dreams can't happen, they will ultimately be proven wrong. While only the uninhibited dream, which is in revolt against reality and its limitations, is truly the most substantive truth of existence. Ultimately, people are going to realize it's not that there's a reality which is true and a dream that is false. What people will eventually realize is that there is only a dream that is true and a reality that is an illusion. May take some time, but that is ultimately what we're going to learn. Rav Kook then concludes, he says, the vision of the dream will return and it will become a clear revelation, right? Dreams are a somewhat hazy experience, right? You're not fully aware and conscious and active during them, right? There's a sense in which you sort of go along with them, but you're not in charge. You don't experience it like you're awake. But Rav Kook's point is ultimately the great dream, the dream of redemption, we will experience as a revelation. It will be as if we are awake. And he cites this verse here from Bamidbar, that God says, I shall speak to him mouth to mouth plainly and not in riddles, and he will behold the likeness of the Lord. We're going to have this face-to-face direct experience of God that will manifest through the context of redemption. That is the conclusion. That is the manifestation. That is the fulfillment of the great dream. And it's very powerful here, the way that Rav Kook ends this piece triumphantly, that the great dream will be fulfilled. We should have hope. We should have optimism. Don't worry about it. And for me personally, this particular text was very, very important. I've always been a bit of a dreamer, as I mentioned, wanting the world to be different than it is. And I had to be a dreamer when I came and I started as the rabbi of Cedar Sinai Synagogue all those years ago, because my job and the job of the leadership at the time was to do the impossible, right? To rebuild the shul, the community, to merge 3 shuls into one, all under the banner of an inclusive and open orthodoxy that was willing to be different than the other shuls there, right? And there was a sense in which we were trying to do something fundamentally different, to go against the grain, to do the impossible. And like Rav Kook describes, it was my own experience and others in the shul in those early years, that the dream that we had, kind of dived headfirst into reality. Because there were a lot of challenges and there were a lot of obstacles and there were a tremendous number of moments where it was like, this is crazy. Like, we're dreamers in the worst sense, that we think this can happen. And again, when your dreams fall apart, right, there's maybe nothing more traumatic and painful than that. And in fact, I'll note this, in some ways, the stress got so difficult for me in those early years that I went a significant stretch. I remember this very clearly, in which I didn't dream. Like, physically, I didn't dream. I'd go to sleep at night, I'd wake up, I wouldn't dream. Now, technically, you always dream. The difference is whether or not you remember your dreams. But for me personally, right, the stress, that's what it does, is a physiological response, is we stop dreaming. And when that happens, right, there's something really bad going on. Because as Rav Kook says, the great dreams are the foundation of the world. We need to dream. We need to remember our dreams. We need to experience our dreams. And when we cannot dream, or the dream seems to be gone, that's when the entire color of life is completely drained. In the end, I think Rav Kook was correct, at least in my own experience, because the dream at the shul did become a reality. Maybe not the exact reality we all had when we started, but there was a sense in that we were able to do the impossible, overcome the obstacles. And Rav Kook's confidence that such a thing was possible, that dreams could become a reality, was very important for me, in giving me the strength that I needed to keep persevering, right? The light that anybody needs when they feel that they're surrounded by darkness. Rav Kook's idealism attracted me to him, but I have to be honest, I also have a bit of an ambivalent relationship with it. And that's the part I want to explore today. Rav Kook wasn't just an idealist. He was a messianist. He believed that the Jewish people's return to the land of Israel was a harbinger of redemption, right? Not even just a harbinger, that just redemption is just about here. Now, why would he think this? There's actually a lot of good reasons why he would think this. And again, as most scholarship on Zionism has pointed out, right, it's best to understand Zionism as a form of secular messianism. Because on a very basic level, if you look at Tanakh, if you look at Chumash, what are the biblical conditions of redemption? Like, how do we know redemption is happening or will take place? What's it going to look like? Right. So the primary example that we see again and again and again is that the Jewish people are going to return to the land of Israel. And they're not just going to return to the land of Israel, but they themselves are going to become transformed in the process. And if that's the way the Torah, the Tanakh depicts the redemption, right, it's not a stretch why people would think that Zionism is offering messianic possibilities. So, we lose sight of this because it's been 100 plus years, 125 years since the first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897. But at the same time, if you can take that historical lens, you have to realize why Zionism and messianism have always been linked, because that was the dream of redemption, right? That was the dream that we pray about in our tefillot all the time, right? To return to Zion, to return to Israel. So when you see that happening, right, you can imagine all sorts of messianic expectations would be inspired by that. And it's those messianic expectations that often give Zionism its power, and also can make it dangerous at times. Like we know this, right? Fire can be a constructive force, but fire can also burn and destroy. And for Rav Kook, again, you saw the sort of idealistic aspiration here, but we have to keep in mind is that for Rav Kook, he is reading history through this lens of redemption, through this messianic lens, and he's interpreting the historical events that are happening in his time through that lens. So, for example, Rav Kook is already seeing the messianic potential in Zionism before he moves to Israel. So already in the late 1890s, turn of the century, he's excited about Zionism, even though he's not a big public or political Zionist. When he moves to Israel in 1904 to become the chief rabbi of Jaffa, of Yaffo, that's when things start to significantly change for him. And there are two major events that happen over the next 10 to 15 years, which really cause him to think that redemption is at hand. The first one is World War I, 1914, 1917, the war to end all wars, the Great War, right? That is a moment that, again, I want to be very clear, not just for Rav Kook, but for many, many people, right? They see within the horrors of World War I, this apocalyptic moment that heralds the redemption. I mean, almost like every major Jewish thinker who lived during World War I saw it as like a potentially messianic opportunity. I want to just be clear about that. It's not Rav Kook is unique here. They all think this because it was so dramatically beyond anything they had known or experienced before. And again, there's always this sense that destruction can potentially bring rebirth and building something new. And then in 1917, with the Balfour Declaration, right, that is the other significant moment. You have the British Empire, maybe the most strongest empire in the world, basically declaring the Jews have a right to return, the Jews have a right to some sort of state or something like that in the land of Israel. And again, through Rav Kook's eyes, these two events, they are the signs that the redemption is coming, right? It is at hand. And that's the way he chooses to read history. And again, this gets carried through everything that he does, everything that he's seeing during his time in Israel. I'll read just a little bit of this, just to give you a sense. Now, again, it's just so obvious to him how all these events fundamentally tie together. He says, at this time, meaning this piece is written Shmona Kvatzim Kovitz Chet. It's basically around after World War I, essentially. And he's seeing all these things coming together for the Jewish people. And he says, at this time when the revival of the nation is stirring, and every day it goes forth from potential to actuality in different shades, the entire world is getting louder with the sounds of war. The hidden trend of which only God has solutions for is certainly to establish the world as the kingdom of God through the return of Israel to a position of strength. So Rav Kook sees the war, he sees the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, he sees all these transformations taking place, and for him, these are the signs of redemption. Because he says here, the Jewish return to the land of Israel is going to bring them back to a position of strength, to be a true and noble people adorned with all its powers and virtues, by whose hand a brilliant light will shine. Meaning the Jewish people's return, they will shine a light. That is the light ultimately of God. The divine light will be revealed. This is the light ultimately of redemption. And he says this is going to affect everything. Every living thing, all the orders of the world, the regimes of the nations, and the moments of the spirit, the movements of the spirit that belong to man in general, and even the heavenly hosts, right? Every aspect of reality, the Jews, the non-Jews, even the heavens are going to are transforming in this time. And he goes on, he says it in a very dramatic fashion. He says, even the heavenly hosts progress and become rectified from the darkness of destruction. I mean, even the angels are becoming purified from where they've been. And the bondage of the Shekhinah and the depths of her exile are developing more and more. The chains in which the feet of Mashiach are bound are becoming more and more broken. They are falling apart, right? This idea that whatever's wrong in the world is finally getting washed away, and the redemptive potential is just about going to be released. And again, this is a historical reading for him. It's not just he's imagining these things, right? And he's looking around him in creation, in history, and this is what he sees, and this is what is being ultimately confirmed. And in the second part of this text, what you see is also a sense in which Rav Kook moves towards an active messianism, meaning there are things we have to do now that the time has arrived in order to bring Mashiach, to bring redemption. And what's interesting, amongst Rav Kook's students decades later, and even in Israel today, the active messianism often translates into a political platform. You got to settle the land, right? It's by settling the land that we're going to help bring redemption, right? For Rav Kook, settling the land is not the primary form of messianic activism. As you'll see here, for him, it's more individualistic, it's more spiritual, it's more cultural. It's primarily active messianism for him is not a directly political enterprise, though sometimes it is. And here's what he says: if you want to bring redemption in this moment of great potential, Mashiach's bonds are being loosened, it's just a matter of time. What do? He says the time has come for everyone who thinks thoughts, every thinker, every counselor, and everyone for whom the Spirit of God has been inspired, the desire for the appearance of the Holy Spirit. Anybody who's plugged into this, anybody who sees the spiritual potential of what is going on, right? They have a role right now. And what's that role? And this holy exaltation is revealed by unique individuals, and everyone who sees in his spirit some sign, even a dark one, from this holy inspiration will courageously incline their ear to the secret of a higher discourse, right? Everybody who is plugged into this has a role, if they have a certain sensitivity to what is going on, to rise above the thoughts of the spirit of the human limited mind and walk in the open space, in the beds of orchards in the highest holy sky. Right? Basically what he's trying to say is those who have spiritual sensitivity to the transformations that are taking place, it's their job to plug into it and to spread the word, right? That's essentially what he's talking about here. And he says, in the good smell of the divine Messiah, Jacob goes and appears through them, right? These individuals, in the spreading of their awareness of what's going on, of their Torah in that sense, right? That is ultimately what is going to also spread the smell of the Messiah. Again, smell is always a spiritual sensibility, right? That is what is being spread. Incline your ear and come to me, hearing your soul shall live. That's how Rav Kook ends this. And again, what he's saying is, if you look at history, redemption is at hand. And that means we have a unique role to play. And that role is specifically for the unique individuals who are spiritually plugged into this. And how can they spread the word? How can they spread this sense of messianic possibility, messianic consciousness? So again, as I said before, at least in this text, the active messianism, which some of us may feel a little uncomfortable with, is not so political. It's not so heavy. But in general, you still confront this. And if you don't believe that redemption is at hand, you might be struck by Rav Kook's either optimism or delusion, depending on what language you want to use here. But again, if we remember back to that first piece, right? Great dreams are what are the foundation of the world. The greatest dream is the dream of redemption. And for Rav Kook, that dream will be made a reality. It's just a question of when. And he looks around reality and he thinks now is definitely the time. So what is the problem with Rav Kook's messianisms? And again, we could spend hours on this. In a basic way, the problem is that everything that he sees and does has to be interpreted through this messianic lens. And that manifests in a few different ways. Number one, if you are a messianist that believes like redemption is now, there's a sense of certainty that grants you, which is profoundly inspiring, but also dangerous. Meaning you believe this is it, right? This is the end of history. There's nothing after this. Everything has been leading up to this moment. When you have that sense of certainty, it provides a profound, inspiration and elevation in your life, a profound sense of inevitability, right? There's no going backwards. But the problem with that is that, as we know, unfortunately, most messiahs are false messiahs. So if you are certain this is redemption, right, there's no way to go back on that if you are proven wrong. And what that means is even if you see things that are disproving your belief that Messiah has come, redemption is now, you're unwilling to accept it. It means basically to look at the world through a messianic lens means a certain willingness to deny reality, or at least deny the aspects of reality that in any way contradict this dream that you have. And that's always dangerous. Anytime you're willing to deny reality, to not believe what your eyes are seeing, right? That is a problem. Number two, if redemption is upon us now, then that also means the world's changing, and the world may not necessarily work according to the rules that it always has. And Rav Kook says this, and he argues, and it's maybe the most naive thing he writes. He says that the Jews, when they went into exile, were forced to leave history. They were forced to leave politics. They didn't have a state. They weren't responsible for themselves or anybody else. They didn't have power over themselves or anybody else. And Rav Kook says there's a purpose to this. The reason the Jews left history is so that when they could return to it once more, when they would have a state, they would engage in a politics that could be done without barbarism, right? There could be a politics that would not be done in a coercive, violent, or dangerous fashion. And that is what the Jews would bring in the time of redemption. So if you really think that, the reason that is so dangerous is because if you look at the state of Israel today, you know very quickly that politics always has an element of barbarism in it. That's what makes it politics. That's what makes it so painful for a lot of us. But if you think that somehow the Jews are immune to the barbarism of politics simply because they've been purified and transformed and redemption is at hand, again, it might cause you to overlook some of the things that are actually going on, right? And if you think that the Jews, I mean, I'm going to use a very stark example here, but if you think that Israel can engage in an occupation of land that is not technically under the sovereign authority of Israel, right? And there are 1.5 million plus people in those places that aren't Jews and aren't citizens. If you think that can be done without barbarism, then again, like, you don't understand anything. No state can function. No set of politics can function without barbarism. And to assume that just because redemption is here, we can sidestep all that is, again, a very challenging assumption. And then the third point, again, all these are related, is that messianic activism of any kind is very dangerous because it can justify anything. If you believe that the redemption is basically here, then you can start coming up with things that are necessary to just get us across the finish line. And once you start thinking that, then anything can be justified, right? You know, what's it going to matter? All we got to do is do this so that redemption can be here, because that's the whole goal of all of this. And it doesn't matter what the cost might be or whatever the sacrifices that might have to be made in the process. And these are the dangers of messianism. And again, I'm not going to spell out how this all plays out politically in Israel today, but I think if you're familiar at all with Israeli politics and even some of the more extreme ends of religious Zionism, right, you know how this plays out. Now, for me, again, what's so challenging is that messianism is at the heart of all of Rav Kook's writings. It fuels that idealism that I personally find so inspiring, that we saw in that first text about the great dreams, that belief that the world can be different, that there is a better world out there, that we can help make it possible. However, again, Rav Kook's messianism is not just a belief in a better world. It's that sense that the redemption is just around the corner. Right, that the state of Israel proves it. We look at history and it's telling us, God's sending us the message clearly, this is it. So the problem I have with this is that, 100 years, almost 100 years since Rav Kook's passing, and as a citizen of the modern state of Israel, I love this place, but it's pretty clear to me that we are not in the time of redemption, and that the Messiah has yet to come. And again, that's very challenging then to keep putting forth this idea that, redemption is just around the corner. We just have to hold on a little longer. And at least for me, when I lived outside of Israel, this question was like a question that bothered me, but it was still ultimately a theoretical one, right? This debate whether or not Israel is the harbinger of redemption. It's a theoretical one when you don't live outside of Israel. But when you live in Israel, this question takes on a different level of meaning. Because it has consequences, right? Like, this is a question that if you live here and you believe we are in the beginning of redemption, it has real consequences to how you're going to think and how you're going to act. And when those consequences are negative, as they sometimes are, it can be deeply unsettling and problematic. And to a large extent, I'm always asking myself, to what extent does Rav Kook have to own those problems, right? The active messianism of today that leads to horrible things. Is Rav Kook responsible for that? Should I be angry at Rav Kook that he put these ideas out there that are dangerous? That at a certain level, I think he's wrong when he thinks redemption is now, that He's almost advocating for a false Messiah, right? Like that's what he thinks Zionism can be. So I want to explore my ambivalence and maybe everybody's ambivalence around these things through a fascinating piece by Franz Rosenzweig, the great German Jewish philosopher. Some of you know that I'm also deeply drawn to Rosenzweig as well, and probably the next book I write will be on Rosenzweig. You might think that Rosenzweig and Rav Kook are an unlikely chavruta. Rav Kook lives in Israel. He's Orthodox from a lineage of great rabbis. He's a mystic. He's a Kabbalist. He's a Zionist, right? Like he comes from one world, and then you have Rosenzweig, who's from Germany, from an assimilated Jewish home. At a certain point in his life, in his mid-20s, he makes this turn towards orthodoxy as a Baal Tshuva. But the two of them could not have more different upbringings. I mean, like literally, you couldn't pick two people who had more different experiences. And if one thing, you would only say the thing they have in common is their brilliance, that they are two of the most brilliant thinkers you will come across, ever. Their brilliance just screams at you in every word and every line of their writings. But what they share in common, as I'll point out, is this dream of redemption, right? Rosenzweig's famous philosophical work is called the Star of Redemption. And you don't put redemption in the title of your great philosophical work unless it's pretty important to you. And for Rosenzweig, redemption is the engine of his whole religious philosophical system. So redemption is very important to him. And the belief that redemption is not just possible, but necessary is very, very important for Rosenzweig. But it's not only this dream of redemption that bonds him and Rav Kook in a sense. After Rosenzweig dies, Gershom Shalom, great scholar of Jewish mysticism in Israel, he gives a eulogy where he summarizes aspects of Rosenzweig's thought, and it gets published. Rav Kook's son, Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, reads this article by Shalom and says, wow, Rosenzweig has a lot of ideas that are similar to my father, and he actually sends a letter to his father, to Rav Kook, about Rosenzweig's ideas. So there is this sense in which Rosenzweig and Rav Kook are maybe not that far removed from each other. And in that sense, I think Rosenzweig can help us maybe better understand where Rav Kook is coming from. And even with the messianism, right? Even 100 years past the point where, redemption is not here. This is a delusion, one might say, not even a dream, right? How can we ultimately relate to it? So to do that, we're going to look at a commentary of Rosenzweig on translations he wrote of Yehuda Halevi's poems. Right, Yehuda Halevi, great medieval Jewish philosopher, Spain, wrote a lot of things. Wrote the Kuzari most famously. Also wrote a lot of poetry. Important Jewish leader. In many ways, Yehuda Halevi is kind of a proto-Zionist. He actually leaves Spain to go to the land of Israel towards the end of his life. And in many ways, Yehuda Halevi is looked at as a precursor of Rav Kook. Yehuda Halevi's thought in the Kuzari has a lot of great influence on Rav Kook, and there's certainly a lot of similarities there. And Rosenzweig feels very drawn to Yehuda Halevi. Rosenzweig actually calls himself a Gilgul of Yehuda Halevi, that he himself is like a reincarnation of Yehuda Halevi. That's how closely he ultimately connects to him. So again, you can see there's a lot of connection points here. Rosenzweig, Yehuda Halevi, Rav Kook. And Rosenzweig translates this particular poem into German, but this is an English translation. And it's a poem that Yehuda Halevi wrote when Yehuda Halevi heard about a messianic figure emerging, I think in Europe somewhere. And Yehuda Halevi's response to this messianic figure is obviously not the Messiah. He writes it in a very enthusiastic poem, though, about the possibility of what this messianic figure can mean, basically urging the messianic figure on. And you read this, I'll read it in a second, and you could hear, Rav Kook, saying these words to Zionism, to the Jewish people's return to the land of Israel. It's the same sense of profound faith and belief in the possibility of transformation. And we just have to coax it along. So this is translated as glad tidings, right? And again, anytime we talk about redemption, tidings, right? This possibility of the future that we're hearing in the present, right? All of those ideas come together. And Yehuda Halevi writes, distant young dove, sing your most beautiful song. And the dove here is the messianic figure. Offer to him, to God who calls you, what is sweet in you. It is him, your God himself, who calls you. Hurry, right? God is calling to the messianic figure. Yehuda Halevi says, we hurry, Messiah, hurry, it's time. Bow down deep to the earth, present your offering. Towards your nest descend, on the way to your tent, right? The messianic figure of the bird is going to come and go to the temple, to the base of Migdash, so to speak. To Tzion, put markers for the way. First friend who sent you away because your actions proved evil, he himself will redeem you today. God's gonna bring this and make it happen. Praise, where did it begin? You are getting ready to return to the many splendored, beautiful land, the empire of Arabia, of Edom. Oh, may they lie in the dust, all who once subdued you. Smite their house. All of those people, wicked people who subdued the Jewish people, who made us suffer, who subjugated us, right? The Messiah's coming means they're all going to get their comeuppance, and we're going to finally be where we're supposed to be. And may love encircle the house of your friend, right? That's this optimistic messianic poem here that Yehuda Halevi writes about this about this particular messianic figure. And on this poem, what happens is on Yehuda Halevi's poems, which Rosenzweig translates, he offers a commentary, and it's not even just a commentary; it's really like essays on the poems. And here's what Rosenzweig says in his understanding. He says the assumption of the publisher, the original publisher or I should say the later publisher who published Halevi's poems of Lozado, may have well been correct, that it was composed under the immediate impact of some reports concerning the appearance of a messianic pretender, a number of which are recorded during that century. Meaning the assumption is the scholarly assumption. Yehuda Halevi wrote this poem in response to a messianic figure. It is not Yehuda Halevi's way to fabricate the situations that motivated him to write certain poems. We shouldn't assume that Halevi was like creating sort of a fantasy poem of like what he would say if Messiah was coming, right? We should read this as no, Yehuda Halevi thought the Mashiach was coming, redemption was at hand, and that is what is motivating him to write this. When they are based on a dream, when Halevi's poems are based on a dream or some vision, he says so. Hence, it was probably an active report that made him write this poem, however long or short the time in which he believed this report. Right. So Rosenzweig is saying this is a genuine messianic poem by Yehuda Halevi. And even if Halevi was going to later find out it wasn't really the Messiah, we should read this poem as an authentic, reflecting the authentic Jewish spirit of anticipating the Messiah's coming in any moment. It's a genuine response by Yehuda Halevi to hearing about this messianic figure. And in it, he affirms his desire that he has reached, that his time is the beginning of redemption. However, as I said, he'll certainly find out this is not the case, and that his messianic expectations were wrong, but we're certainly left wondering, like, what's the meaning of this poem? Should we look at this poem as a tragic poem? Oh, Yehuda Halevi, like, you just didn't know better. What's wrong with you? You know, you're so excited, so inspired. You thought everything was going to change. You should have known better, right? Like, we can look at it that way. However, there is another way to look at this, and that's what Rosenzweig wants us to realize, that there's something we can learn from Halevi's poem. This is what he says. He says, thus, we may surmise that Yehuda Halevi paid accustomed duty to his faith, right? That Yehuda Halevi, in believing the Messiah had come, he was paying taxes on his faith. He was doing something he had to do as a man of faith, right? If there's only two certainties in life, death and taxes, right? Like if you're a faithful person, then the taxes of that faith, as a Jew at least, are a belief that the Messiah will come. And that means that there's going to come a moment where you're going to have to pay the tax. You're going to have to believe it. For the expectation of the Messiah, by which and for the sake of which Judaism lives, would be an empty theological statement, a mere idea, empty talk, had it not been for the appearance of some false Messiah that again and again would actualize and frustrate that idea, raise and disappoint that hope. The false Messiah is as old as the hope for the true one. He is the ever-changing form of that abiding hope. He divides every Jewish generation into those whose strength of faith allows them to be deceived, and those whose strength of hope does not allow them to be deceived. The former are the better ones, the latter are the stronger ones. The former bleed as sacrifices on the altar of the people's eternity. The latter serves as priests before the altar. So I'm going to explain what all this means. I just wanted to get you the whole piece there. Look, as modern people, we tend to look negatively on messianism and the false messiahs it creates, right? That's our natural approach, right? We look at people who think the Messiah has come and we're like, they're crazy. What's wrong with them, right? Like, simple example is Chabad today, right? 20 years after the Rebbe died, they're still singing, Yechia Danenu, like this belief that the Rebbe is alive and is the Mashiach, right? And it's hard not to look at that and be like, what's wrong with these people? I think that's the natural response of a modern person when you see messianism in full bloom. But Rosenzweig asks us not to be so judgmental. He says that there's something deeply fundamental going on here. He actually says we need false messiahs. We need to have false messiahs, which sounds a little bit crazy. Why is this? Because he argues there can be no belief in the Messiah at all without the coming of false messiahs. Because the false Messiah is the guarantor of the belief in redemption. So what exactly does this mean? As a Jew, we know we're supposed to believe in redemption. It's an article of faith. Not only are we supposed to believe in redemption, we're supposed to believe that it can come any day, right? We say, Maimonides says it this way, B'chol yom sheyavo, right? Any day the Messiah can come. That's how strong our belief is. Not only do we believe that the Messiah can come any day, we pray for it, we yearn for it, we desire it. Our tefillot from beginning to end are filled with prayers for redemption, right? We say, Baruch Hashem Goel Yisrael, Uvenei Yerushalayim, is over everything we do, and Shemona Esrei, benching, doesn't matter. It's always about looking towards redemption. We can't escape it. We're expressing our faith in it, in redemption, and our hope for it all the time. But the real question is what comes next. Because if we're to live our lives believing in redemption, yearning for redemption, then there will be inevitably moments when we will start believing that redemption may in fact be at hand. We will see the signs, so to speak, as Yehuda Levi did in his time, and as Rav Kook certainly did in his own time, right? We'll see the signs. Maybe it'll be a charismatic religious leader who will rise up and they'll do incredible things for the Jewish people, bring Jews back to religious life, right? As the Lubavitcher Rebbe did. I mean, as a charismatic religious leader, he checked every box about what you might want the Mashiach to be, or the situations before us today, right? As a Zionism. The Jewish people returned to the land of Israel from all four corners of the globe, just as the prophets described. And not only have we returned, but we have renewed ourselves after nearly total destruction, right? This is what redemption looks like, either of these. This is what redemption looks like. And if you really believe, when you finally start seeing these things, there better be a part of you that's willing to believe that redemption is finally at hand. Because when the time comes, when you're faced with this, every Jew has a choice to make. Do we have the faith to say that, yes, redemption is today, it's finally here? As Rav Kook said regarding Zionism, about the Jewish return to the land of Israel, as many great rabbis did in the time of Shabtai Tzvi, right? The greatest false messiah of the last few hundred years, right? Most probably of the great rabbis of his time thought that he was Mashiach, right? Or do we say, as I personally feel regarding the Jewish return to the land of Israel, do we say not yet? Sorry, redemption is not yet. It's not here yet. Rather, we just have to have hope that it may be at some point in the future. Right? It's easy as a modern rational person to look down judgmentally on those who have the faith to say, yes, redemption is today, right? I said that's the natural reaction to Chabad. That's the natural reaction to sort of the messianic wing of the extremely messianic wing of religious Zionism. We often look at people who think these things as if they're naive, like they're children, like they're dreamers, but not dreamers in the positive sense that Rav Kook used it, right? Dreamers in the dismissive sense, right? That there's something wrong with them. Don't they know what reality really is like? We often even get angry at people who do this, who have these messianic fantasies, because they're acting as if their fantasies are real. And what we want them to do is to get with the real world, right? We want them to realize, sorry, you have this dream, you have this fantasy. That's not reality. You got to get with the real world. And in fact, we get angry with them. We get frustrated with them. And what often happens, at least here in Israel, right, there's an attitude of secular Israelis towards Haredim who may not even be having a fantasy of redemption, but Haredim have their own fantasy. And the secular Zionists here in Israel will basically say, see those dreamers, those people with the fantasies who are disconnected from the reality? Well, we got to do everything we can to shatter those fantasies for them, right? To force them to confront what reality is, right? That's why part of the reason what drives Israelis to want to draft Haredim into the army, obviously they think it's the equitable thing to do. They should serve for the country. On the other hand, it's also a sense like, we got to get those Haredim out of their dream. We got to get them into the real world. We got to shatter it and make them see what reality really is. Now, there is a dark truth about those who say not yet, and I put myself in that category. Those ones who say, yeah, it looks like redemption's almost here, but sorry, we still got to wait. You got to chill out, right? When people think that way, and like I said, I do too. they don't always mean that we must wait for redemption at some point in the future. What they often mean, and I'll even put myself in here sometimes too, when they say redemption is not yet, is what they're kind of saying to themselves and to others really, is that redemption is never going to come, right? Like that not yet can very easily become never. And that is a challenge that Rosenzweig is trying to get at. We need the false messiahs to remind us that never is not an option, because it's very easy to slip from not yet into never. And I'll give you just one, brief example of this. Yisrael Leibovitz, great Israeli thinker, religious thinker, not a big fan of messianic thinking, to say the least. He had a little bit of a relationship with Rav Kook. He respected Rav Kook as a person, didn't really love his messianic beliefs and some of his other Kabbalistic metaphysical beliefs. That in one of his major essays, Yisrael Leibovitz states very clearly, it's titled On Redemption, the Dawn of Redemption. And he also lays out two positions here on redemption, similar to Rosenzweig, but different. He says there's basically two approaches to redemption, to future redemptions of the Messiah. He says the first approach, the messianic redemption, is a fact, right? In the same way the redemption from Egypt was a fact, so too the future redemption is a fact. It's just a question of when, right? That's the position, the standard Jewish position. But then Leibovitz gives us a second alternative, and it's the position that he really likes. He says the messianic redemption means a direction and a target one has to strive towards, and the attainment of which is a task laid upon man. One should understand in this sense the words of Tosafot. No prophets prophesy anything else than what ought to be. Now, what Leibovitz is saying here is that our real attitude towards redemption should be, it's an ideal that we strive towards, but it's never going to happen, right? This isn't something we should ever really assume is going to be a reality. And this is Leibovitz's position, but it's, as I said, as a modern person, it's a position for a lot of us to find ourselves in. Leibovitz's argument is that it represents an ideal, right? And that ideal motivates us, and we keep trying to better the world as we achieve that ideal, even though we're never going to actually reach it. And Leibovitz has in here basically one of his famous lines, most famous lines. He says, according to the first view, redemption is a separate article of faith. First view says redemption is going to happen. It's just a question of when. But the second view, the Messiah is the one whom I wait for every day and who will come, whereas the Messiah who has come is always a false Messiah. This is his famous line. Any Messiah who comes is a false Messiah, which basically means that no Messiah can ever be a true Messiah, because the very fact they've come proves that they aren't the Messiah, right? It's basically a paradox that he's trying to set up here, because for him, messianic redemption is not something that ever happens in this world. It's a dream that animates us and motivates us. It's a dream that never becomes reality. It's not yet, it's never. Now, it's easy to agree with Leibovitz, and he offers this sort of interpretation here, reinterpretation of redemption. A lot of us want a better world, and we all know that messianism is messy business. We have to be sober adults about things, about politics, about life. We can try to make things better, but any more than that, and we risk creating terrible problems. Messianism could lead to disappointment, terrible disappointment, religious collapse, that trauma of the dream shattering. Shabtai Tzvi, in the wake of Shabtai Tzvi being proven a false Messiah, it almost destroyed like Jewish faith, because most of the Jewish world believed he was the Messiah, and when he converted to Islam and all of that, it broke people. It broke a lot of people in terrible ways. Messianism can also lead to sectarianism, right? There are new religions that come out of Judaism anytime a new false Messiah comes, right? Jesus being the most famous example of that, right? As I said, messianism is messy business. It's like playing with fire. It's easy for us to think we don't really want to have any part of that. My real problem, however, with Leibovitz here, and it's one that Rosenzweig helps us understand, is that his reinterpretation of redemption as an ideal we strive for but never achieve, that dream that animates us but never is made real in reality, that approach makes a mockery of Jewish religious life. Because what Leibovitz is effectively saying is that when we sing Ani Ma'amin be'emuna shlema b'viyat Mashiach, or when we recite many prayers beseeching God for redemption, Leibovitz is saying we don't really mean it. We're saying the words, but we're paying lip service to them at best. It's an ideal, right? It animates us, it motivates us, it inspires us. We don't really think those things are gonna happen. That's essentially Leibovitz's point. Rosenzweig completely disagrees with Leibovitz, and the idealist philosophical tradition that Leibovitz is drawing his ideas upon, certain Kantian, neo-Kantian frame that Rosenzweig completely disagrees with. Because for Rosenzweig, belief has to be something real, not something imagined, even if the beautiful picture we imagine motivates us to do good. A messianism that is just an ought, the way things ought to be, and never an is, the way things are, is simply not meaningful. And Rosenzweig makes this very clear in a letter to Benno Jacob towards the end of Rosenzweig's life. Benno Jacob is a Reform rabbi, writes a commentary on the Chumash. And Rosenzweig is arguing with Benno Jacob about the importance of messianism, right? That you have to, if you're praying for redemption, if you're saying those words, like you have to believe it is real. He says, I have no idea how one should pray for something one beholds beforehand to be impossible. If you're going to pray for redemption and believe redemption is possible, then Rosenzweig saying, I know what you're doing. Like, this is what you say, I know what the heck you're doing, thinking this is like, redemption is this ought that could happen, or should happen, but won't happen. Like, what are you doing then when you pray? I cannot pray, Rosenzweig says, that 2 times 2 should be equal to 5, right? That's insane, right? You're basically praying for a contradiction, right? And that's what Leibowitz is doing here. The eternal, which we Jews mean, lies not in the infinite, not like some infinite horizon we never reach, but rather in the speedily in our days. That's what redemption means. At some point, it's going to be here in our days, now. That which comes in eternity doesn't come for all eternity. If you push redemption beyond the horizon, it's never going to come. It's only coming never, right? And that for Rosenzweig is simply not acceptable as a Jew. Do we believe, this is what he's saying, in not just the possibility of redemption, but in its inevitability? Not will it happen, but when it will happen. That's Rosenzweig's point. We have to believe that. Rosenzweig teaches us that false messiahs, in all the messiness they represent, remind us that faith must be real. Because the only way you know if faith and redemption is real is if you have a false messiah. If you're willing to be tempted into believing that the Messiah has come. The Jewish yearning for redemption must be real in some tangible historical fashion, or it is faith in 2 times 2 equals 5. It's essentially an empty theological statement, as Rosenzweig said. And the test of whether or not a belief is true is whether, in fact, it can be made real, or at least there's an attempt to make it real, that someone attempts to show that it's possible. Rosenzweig points out, not here, but in other places, that if you want to know what somebody believes, you don't ask them to reflect on their beliefs and tell you, right? We often think that we determine what we believe by expressing ourselves through language. We think about who we are, we reflect on ourselves and our choices, and we put it into language and explain what we believe. But in the end, that tells you very little because words are cheap. And Rosenzweig knows this. Rosenzweig loves words, but he knows words are cheap. Because if we really want to know what someone believes, we should not listen to their words, but we should look at how they act. And as you get older in life, you know this very quickly. People say all sorts of things. Talk is cheap, but if you want to know what people really think, what they really believe, see how they act. Actions are hard, and because of this, actions always speak louder than words. That's why they embed belief, they reflect belief far more than anything we might say. And I should add on this note, Rav Kook would heartily agree with Rosenzweig that actions ultimately are what matter, that speak louder than words. Because when Rav Kook talks about the great dream of redemption, he is very clear that it is only meaningful to the extent that one tries to make it real in the world. To sit off in the corner and be satisfied with your fantasy that you have is basically just a beautiful daydream. And it's the opposite of what Rav Kook thought. Rav Kook felt the dream had to be a reality. To just live in your little fantasy world and be happy with that is not good enough. What you have to understand is that when Rosenzweig writes this whole reflection on false messiahs, he has Zionism in mind. Rosenzweig is a critic of Zionism for a host of reasons, which we don't have time to get into. But even though he's a critic of Zionism, he also writes that Zionism preserves the messianic ideal of Judaism, right? Zionism preserves that messianic ideal because it reflects it, right? Jewish return to the land of Israel, Jewish hope for a fundamentally better future, for transformation, for renewal, for change, for goodness, for justice, for the light of God to spread throughout the world. Rosenzweig is willing to acknowledge that Zionism does something holy, even as he believes it's a false messiah. And I think this is very, very important. For most of Zionism's critics, messianism is exactly what makes it so dangerous and evil. The Orthodox rabbinic establishment that opposed Zionism, they opposed it because of its messianism. Satmar Rebbe being the classic example of that. However, according to Rosenzweig, those who believe that redemption is now, They are the ones who remind the rest of us what real faith looks like. Because it's easy to say the Messiah is going to come, but until you're willing to like stake your life on it, right, you don't know that it's real. And for most of us who say, well, not yet, it's not yet, like, don't get your hopes up, like, don't get so excited. It's those who take the plunge that remind us what it's actually supposed to look like. Your faith has to be strong enough that you are tempted to believe in the false Messiah, right? That's the only way you know you have real faith on a certain level for Rosenzweig. And when I take all this in, what it causes me to do is to really think differently about Rav Kook. And even though I disagree with him and don't believe redemption is now, I have to ask myself whether part of my resistance to believing that the Zionist project is culminating in redemption, I have to ask myself, maybe it's because I'm lacking in emunah in some way. Perhaps I don't really believe redemption can be today. And I have to confront the question of whether my cynicism has got the better of me and whether I've simply cloaked it in a language of rationalism, right? Maybe even worse, maybe I don't want redemption to be now. Maybe deep down, I like the world as it is because it works pretty well for me. I have a pretty good life. I live in Israel now and, my kids are doing great. We're doing great, right? Why would I want to believe in redemption, that redemption is now, and risk everything being transformed into some unknown future, no matter how wonderful people imagine it to be? And studying the teachings of Rav Kook forces us all to confront this, to confront what it really means to believe. And even if we believe he's a false Messiah, it's a reminder that is, as he said, the custom tax of faith, as Rosenzweig said it. That's the tax you have to pay to kind of know if your faith is real or not, to be reminded what real faith looks like. And if we're unwilling to confront this, we risk a lot, perhaps everything. As Rosenzweig says here in the conclusion, he says, one day it will be the reverse, with the faith of the faithful becoming the truth and that of the hopeful made into a lie. Right? Someday, the people who think the Mashiach has come are going to be right. And someday, the people who think that the Mashiach has still not yet come, they're going to be wrong. And when that day comes, then, and no one knows whether this then may not even come today, even later tonight, maybe as soon as we're done with this year, the task of the hopeful will be at end, the hope being the ones who keep saying not yet. They'll be wrong at that point. When the dawn of this today has arrived, anyone who is still among the hopers and not amongst the believers must risk becoming an outcast. This is the threat that hangs over the seemingly less dangerous life of the one who hopes. The people who say it's not yet, right, that Mashiach has not yet come, Israel's not yet redemption, they are the hopers, and I put myself in that category. But there's a position of risk there too. We think being a messianist is the risky part, right? At least all these crazy, difficult things. But there's also a risk in continuously saying not yet, which Rosenzweig points out. One day redemption will come and we may not be ready for it. And we risk being on the outside looking in, or even worse, when the time comes for redemption, we risk standing in opposition to it. That's even worse. Rosenzweig doesn't say that here, but that's often the case, right? That our own cynicism can turn us into the obstacle of the very thing that we, on some level, pay lip service that we care about. In truth, and this is what I take away from all of this, and I say this, very proudly on Rav Kook's yahretzeit and our Yom Aliyah, I need Rav Kook. I need Rav Kook in his messianic beliefs and fear and fervor and all of that. I think all of us need Rav Kook, even if we believe he is wrong, because his example and his Torah remind us of a fact that is so easy to forget. Is there a danger in believing that redemption is now? Of course. And I don't believe redemption is now. But there is also a danger in believing that redemption will never come. And that's the cynical position that is so easy to fall into, especially as a modern person who sees all the dangers with messianism, that is sober and rational, believes in science. Miracles aren't just going to happen tomorrow. You can't depend on it, right? It's very easy to slide from that position into a place in which we don't even think redemption is truly possible. That the world as it is right now, with all of its injustice and evil, is all that can be, except perhaps with some slight tinkering and improvements here and there. In many ways, religious Zionism, since its founding by Rav Kook, has been at the crossroads of faith and hope, as Rosenzweig describes it. Faith that redemption is now, and contrasted against the hope that redemption will come someday. Rav Kook, as we know, tended towards faith, that we had reached Reshit Smichat Gulatenu, the beginning of the flowering of our redemption, that the dream was finally being made real. And even if we think he was in error, as I said, I still think that we need him and his Torah, because without him, we might forget that the dream of redemption is real. Because all false messiahs, what they do is not prove redemption is wrong. They remind us that redemption ultimately has to be real. And as Rav Kook wrote, the dream, the great dream, is the foundation of the world. And someday, perhaps even tomorrow, that dream is going to be a reality.